I how's it going?
Okay, we're just getting into it then. Getting
Yeah,
straight
right
into
into it.
it.
Yeah,
It's going all right, like I said. Oh, I can see my audio waveform now. Anyways,
yeah. There we
audio
go.
problems previously. But I mean, I don't know what I'm talking about on this podcast, to be honest. I don't really know what's going on. I just know it's about Oxford students, is the
Don't
idea.
worry. That's the energy of this episode. It's going to be all about just get into it, accepting the fact that you know, whenever you try something new, it's okay to feel like you can't do it. Uh, there's a poster to that effect at Vauxhall Bridge in London, and every single time I come back from the gym on my Boris bike, I see that poster, and it just sustains me. Although I think the precise wording is, it's okay to feel like you can't do it when you're starting something new. So that's going to be the
Mm.
ethos of today. However, you're definitely someone who feels like, who knows that they can do it. I'm working on the segue game. Luther, it's good to see you.
It's
Do you
good to
want to
see you
just
too,
start
Rick.
by saying like your degree, your college, just some stuff that people should know about you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the person I'm talking to is Rick. He has not introduced himself, but yeah, I'll go into a bit about me then. I'm studying experimental psychology, same as Rick, and I'm at St. Catherine's College, and I'm going into the second year. Although, in theory, I should be going into third year if I did not take a year off from uni, because I actually started my degree in 2020, hit some health problems, started again in 2021, and here I am now going into second year when my friends are going to the third year, which is a bit of a, it feels a bit weird, but not really at the same time. I feel like you might have some more experience about these things where there's some sort of gap between what you and your uh, friends from like university have been doing, considering that this is actually the second degree that you're doing, right?
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot in there, and I think you've done the hosting for me at this point. I've delegated successfully. There's definitely a bit to that. I guess when it comes to being a student, it's one of those things where there's a lot of movies and songs that describe what to expect. It's within Western culture, not exclusively, but also within Western culture. And being a mature student doesn't necessarily fit that mold. And so you do have these notions of what it's going to be like, and it doesn't necessarily align with those. But I think there's a lot of pros and cons, and fundamentally, I'm just happy to be at Oxford, even if it is 4 years later than most people that get here. But there definitely are a few stumbling blocks, and that'd be interesting to get into since you and I are to a degree within that position, although you're coming in to do your second year a year later than most, whereas I'm coming in 4 years later than most.
Mm.
But it is what it is. With respect to experimental psychology, how have you found it so far?
I mean, I'm enjoying the course. To be honest, like I'm don't regret taking psychology. I think if I had to choose any other degree, it would literally I would not choose a different degree if that makes sense. So I think that's me being on the right track. But also at the same time, I think specifically in Oxford, there's so much to learn. There's some bits I'm like I can't be bothered to learn this. Like for example, in social psychology, I love
You got to be
social
careful though, because
psychology.
what if a professor sees this?
Look, I
Just
love social psychology. It's just
too busy. Yeah, go
you
ahead.
have to memorize the names of every concept, and I find that a
Mm,
bit tedious.
yeah, yeah.
Like, although I really enjoy the thing, it's just I find it quite repetitive for them to basically say the same thing in a different way every lecture or so, like
Mm,
subsequent
mm.
lectures, and then you kind of have to. You can quite easily wrap your head around the concepts. It's just memorizing the exact wording of each concept that's a bit tedious, and then having to replicate that in an essay. But luckily, we're an open book this year, which so it wouldn't be too
Yeah,
bad. I think it'll be a lot harder when it's not, if that makes sense.
yeah. There's definitely a lot to that. When it comes to open book and closed book, I think that, well, firstly, I've never really had the experience of writing a closed book essay outside of the entrance exams. However, what my limited experience says is that with an open book essay exam, you can focus less on the memorization of pre baked essay plans, and you can focus more on putting together everything that you know, and also in the act of transforming your lecture notes into something that you could interface with much faster in a time pressure setting, you end up with much better notes that actually carry over onto further revision, and B, it allows you to synthesize across lectures. And I'd like to think that the professors feel the same way, in that there's this sort of burden on professors at Oxford to produce new exam questions for essays every year. And they have to sort of walk the fine line between creating questions where everyone fails and creating questions where everyone succeeds, and somewhere in the middle. And so they have to take into account, okay, what can we realistically ask of students? If it's closed book, that spectrum of what can we realistically ask is much more narrow. And so I feel like ultimately it's better for professors and it's better for students to keep the essays open book. But I guess time will tell. I know that some of the departments, I think the English department at Oxford has just decided flat out to keep it open book forever, or for the foreseeable future, because it's just a different
Oh,
dynamic.
really?
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure if somebody that does English hears this, they'll tell me in very well articulated detail as to where I'm wrong. But I think that's the case. There are departments that have decided so, at the very least.
I mean, I've heard that, well, in our third year, we're not doing open book, are we? So for third year, I heard it's just everything's closed book as it usually would be. And I'm
Hmm.
not sure about the upcoming year because they're changing the whole experimental psychology course into a 4 years integrated master's. And instead of having like the exam at the end of the second term, they're going to have the exam at the end of the third term, which makes a lot more sense. I don't know
Hmm.
why
Hmm.
they do it the way they do right now. So I have no idea how it's actually going to be for the future psychologists who go to Oxford, to be honest.
It's going to be interesting. I know that a third year student who did psychology and philosophy told me that the Department of Psychology has received flack over the years for being too hard. And again, this is hearsay for anybody at the department that hears this. I have to be careful because I use Oxford vaguely in the branding of the podcast, so there is a certain standard to which one has to adhere. But obviously, this is how I genuinely feel with no filter attached. Regardless, the department historically has had very difficult exams from the standpoint of many students that pass through. And so it's weird seeing this development that it's going to be a 4 year Master of Science in neuroscience rather than a Bachelor of Arts in psychology,
Hmm.
and which can then extend to that. And part of it, I think, is that initially philosophy thought a lot about the mind, and the natural sciences didn't necessarily have the instruments to measure things about the mind. So a lot of it was about introspection and just sort of these subjective takes on what happens in a person's head. And so it was only really with animal experiments and neuroimaging, roughly speaking, that allowed us to really get into something empirical and measurable, which is when the scientists really got on board and took the mind seriously. But I feel like, in a way, the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction because it's becoming neuroscience and not psychology. I
Yeah.
feel like there's a subtle distinction there because psyche is the soul, roughly speaking, and so ordering of the soul, and then neuroscience is knowing the brain, and those aren't the same thing. And I feel like a lot of psychologists want the prestige of wearing a white lab coat, being in a lab. You've heard me say this before, but I might as well reiterate that there's this. I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's that shift, and I guess it makes sense that science is interested in that which is empirical, that which is measurable. That's the purview of science. But sometimes I feel like if there's all of these theories that are begging to be tested, that provides an impetus for people who develop these technologies to go further. Would it be the case that we would have developed fMRI and PT and all of these brain scanning technologies if there wasn't a backlog of things that we wanted to test? And so when it comes to things that are more spiritual, that only Jung and Freud really looked at, well, their associated schools, I feel from my limited 1 year of doing this degree, it feels like we've just sort of sidestepped that because science can't really measure those things. And yet, a large part of psychology is figuring out how the people's minds work and how can they live well, a meaningful life. I don't know what your position on that is.
Yeah. I mean, because I did a module of philosophy in my first year, I've kind of looked a bit more into that side of it, things. And psychology was, well, the roots of psychology is philosophy, isn't it? Like looking into the mind. And a lot of people say the study of philosophy is so that one can live a good life or figure out what a good life is. So perhaps that side of things is more so philosophy rather than psychology, although there is a bit of a gray area in that, because psychology in and of itself is there's a lot of subjectivity within psychology, because you can't really say that this is exactly how humans are going to behave, because there are always exceptions, because there's always differences in brains, differences in how people perceive things. Like, we can't know how another person really perceives anything. If you think about it, sorry, it's the this kind of individuality that we have is something maybe you can never really scientifically measure, because how can you possibly know what another person is experiencing unless you have actually been that person? Which might be a bit more of a philosophical view rather than a psychological view, because I think the point of psychology is to try to separate, I guess, itself from philosophy by making itself more scientific. So that's probably the reason they're heading in that direction, really. But at the moment, it's still really like, it's early days, right? I mean, psychology was really invented in like what, the 1900s, or like the actual subject of
Yeah, with
psychology.
Wilhelm Wundt and
Yeah,
the German
Wilhelm
school.
Wundt
Yeah.
in 18 something, late 1800s,
Somewhere there. We're
somewhere.
just having a momentary brain fog. It's very evident that we know these facts by heart for anybody that's
Yeah, yeah, we
professorial
100% know
and
these.
listening.
Don't worry,
It's
we're
just
not.
podcast effect.
It's not the case that we have notes in a separate Word document that we copy paste into the essays because it's open book. But no, it's not
That's not
that.
possible. That's not possible. Well, they locked it
What
in
are you on
anyway,
about?
so we might as well divulge. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that many sciences, to a degree, have a relationship with philosophy. Um, Mathematics is a weird one. I'll get flack for saying this, but it's not exactly a science because it's outside the realm of the empirical. It's logical and exists within us. You don't do a natural observation. You don't have a mathematical lab where you put numbers in a beaker. It exists, at the very least, we can say that it isn't a natural science. And so all of these questions of, are mathematical concepts discovered or invented? That's one tie that mathematics has to philosophy. And then in a way, physics has that connection where we don't the West isn't has an agnostic vibe to it, if not an atheistic vibe now. And if we think about Newton's laws of physics, those were laws. They
Mm.
implied the existence of a lawgiver or law creator. Because otherwise you get into a very murky territory of, how can there be knowledge that described a part of the world if there was no one to know it? And to expand on that, when you have God, for instance, God knows about the law of gravity, but no humans know about it. And then Newton uh, articulates knowledge about that and then shares it with others. And so now this knowledge is available to both God and to human beings, and it describes sort of consistent phenomena within the world. If you remove God from that sort of equation or that worldview, then what you have is the law of gravity exists, but until Newton articulates it, where does that knowledge exist? You could
Mm.
say that he creates it, but then gravity existed well before his articulation of it. I know it's a weird tangent to go on philosophically, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I can't believe that Newton did light experiments when he was 23 and I'm 24, and I feel kind of bad about that. But also that some of the sciences have a closer relationship to philosophy than others. I'm ignorant just in general, but it's my impression that biology doesn't consistently collide with philosophy at the same level. And I feel like one of the psychology, as a product of being so young, has a very close relationship to philosophy that to a degree we're losing. And I wonder whether or not that's a good thing. Whether or not, for instance, Oxford is going to, as rumor has it, stop offering experimental psychology and only offer neuroscience. And so the purview of the psyche is sort of going to be shifted away as, oh, we tried, but we can't really figure out anything new that's measurable and reproducible. So let's just put it aside into a box. You know what I mean?
So, is it true that it's going to become a degree in neuroscience now? Because I don't actually fully know what the title of the course is going to be, as in the masteral course.
I it I know that a neuroscience master's degree already exists. Whether or not they choose to create a separate master's for experimental psychology, I'm not sure. So
Okay.
my whole spiel might be completely invalidated by their decision. So
And we'll
one can only
find out
hope.
like next month. We'll find out in a month. So,
Because I've been reading a bit of Jung this summer, and that's been quite interesting. I read Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and I read a very short introduction to Jung. And then obviously I've read Peterson's Maps of Meaning, which builds a lot on Jung's ideas. And although most of Jung's theories were built on his experience as a psychiatrist in first working in insane asylums and then having private upper middle class patients in Switzerland, he built his theories based on purely anecdotal evidence within his professional career. At least his later ideas about maybe he participated in some studies when he was in med school. My point being is that Jung is parapsychological now. It's considered somewhat mystic, and yet he still built his theories on a solid body of work. It just wasn't peer reviewed. And so I sort of lament the fact that someone who clearly devoted a large part of his life to figuring out how to keep people healthy psychologically, that seems a little bit neglected. The distinction between Freud and Jung that's pointed out by admittedly Jungians who have a bias is that Freud focused on what makes people sick and Jung focused on what makes people healthy, what keeps them healthy. And so I just sometimes wonder whether or not our degree has, at least in the first year, has adopted, and I love it, to be clear. This is, I'm talking about it because I love it. And if you love something, you want to see it improve, or at least talk about how maybe it could improve. Whenever we get onto the how does this knowledge transfer onto treatment, it's always talking about the sick and getting rid of sickness rather than promoting healthiness and health. What's your take on that?
I mean, the focus on the sick is probably initially because when you see someone healthy, there's nothing to fix, really. It's kind of like, oh, you're living your life, you're fine for the most part. There's nothing that we can do, really. Like, what's the point of helping you out if you're already somewhat helped, if that makes sense? Whereas someone who's ill, you look at them, you're like, oh, we can fix this. There's a way that we can elevate this person to a normal state of living. So I think that's probably why there's a focus on that. But also, what I was thinking was in the whole realm of kind of pseudoscience, if you wish.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people call it that now because how can you replicate these things? Have you heard of Sam Harris? Have you heard?
Yes,
Yeah,
I've heard of Sam Harris. He's a phenomenal
yeah. I think
thinker.
he might have used to be a neuroscientist. I'm not 100% sure on that one, but he definitely has studied a lot in kind of just consciousness in general. I think because the reason psychology is so like gray in terms of whether it's true or not. I think it's because the whole subject of psychology, it's like there is an aspect of it that goes back to pure consciousness of a person existing and experiencing life, which is literally impossible to study because how can you really quantify what consciousness actually is unless you talk about it in some sort of metaphorical way that people can somewhat understand, because not everyone really thinks about that, as in why do you experience things in the first place. I think Sam Harris has said that neurology and all of this neuroscience, you can study like why we feel, well, not why we feel, but like you can study the things that we feel and what stimulus causes what sensation, or like what behavior causes another behavior, but you can't possibly find out why do we experience these things in the first place. Like, can you measure that? Is that something that's measurable? I don't really think it's something you can quantify as how conscious is someone or
Mm.
something like that.
I mean, I've had some experiences with people that I don't like where that's a prominent question I want to ask of just how conscious they are, or the lack thereof. There was an interesting guest I think it was on the Joe Rogan podcast, who was interested in the psychology of intelligence, which, to my understanding, has been a little bit neglected since the bell curve came out, because it had a
Mm.
chapter that discussed the idea of different racial groups in the United States scoring differently on IQ. I believe the implicit statement was there might be nutritional or pathological factors that are impeding the ability of groups within the United States to perform at the level that they should be performing, and that's a tragedy, and we should figure out the underlying mechanism. The way that that was read was some races are stupider than others, hooray racism. So since then,
Mm.
the psychology of intelligence has been in a sketchy area. Regardless, this guest was saying that he was interested in whether or not there are higher and lower levels of consciousness with respect to attention plus something. I guess it's kind of like intelligence. Sorry, attention. I'm butchering his idea. The point I bring this up is that he wanted to see whether or not people that score higher on IQ tests take more, require more anesthesia to be put into that sedated state, and whether or not scoring lower on an IQ test is some places you somewhere on a spectrum of just how much anesthesia it takes to take you out of consciousness. It's and apparently in the United States, at least. Sorry about that. Everything needs to be. There we go. We'll edit that part out, I'm sure.
Okay.
So, when it comes to consciousness, do you think that it could be layered? Do you think that some people could be more conscious than others, or that? Well, I guess we kind of know that people can be more or less conscious throughout the day. They're awake and they're asleep, but you can also be drowsy.
By consciousness, do you mean the ability to basically realize that you're conscious, or kind of like just basic consciousness, as in being in a coma or being awake, etc.?
Well, I guess that's the question of should those, if we operationalize that term and get really specific about it, should it just be a binary state? Or should it represent, well, I guess what I'd argue for is that it's the degree to which you're able to interface with reality and react behaviorally to changes in your direct environment. And so,
Mm.
in that lens, sleep, obviously, there's changes in your environment. And unless it's a very loud noise or a sudden shift in temperature, you're not going to react to it behaviorally. Whereas if you're hyper alert and you've just souped yourself up on adrenaline, then you're going to immediately react to changes in your environment.
I mean, you could also argue that if you put it that way, the the kind of argument that comes into my head is that if someone's like souped up on adrenaline or is basically super stressed, that's what we're talking about here. Someone's super stressed. Are they? Is there an aspect of them that isn't conscious? Because once at that point, you're not really making decisions. You're kind of just acting on circumstances around you rather than taking it in and processing it. You're just kind of like, boom, react to this, boom, react to that, because you're so stressed that you're at the point where you can't really, I guess, take it in. You're just kind of doing things. Is that
Mm.
really consciousness? Because it doesn't sound that conscious to me, if that makes sense.
So it's more reflexive rather than being reflective.
Yeah, I mean, my personal idea of consciousness, it's not really a scientific thing. It's just someone is more conscious if they're able to kind of take in everything as it is and kind of just be okay with how it is. So basically, just being able to experience what's there. I mean, a lot of people talk about this kind of like, well, the practice of mindfulness is meant to gravitate you towards that state of being where you can just be okay with everything how it is and experience everything as it is, rather than, I guess, creating, which what most of us do, including myself, is create false delusions in our heads about, oh, maybe this is going to happen or maybe this is going to happen, and just stressing so much that we're not really experiencing anything, and we're just kind of, well, we are experiencing something, but it's all in our heads and it's mostly negative.
Mm. Yeah, the analogy that I think Sam Harris is the one who proposed it, although I heard it through the Rogan podcast.
Mm.
This vacation, I had so much free time that I managed to watch the Rogan episodes as they came out. It was, you know, that something's not right in your daily schedule if you're keeping up with them.
Is it
If it's
every
not just
day
the,
or is it twice a week? I feel like it's twice a week, right?
I think it's up to 4 or 5 times a week. The guy just sits
Seriously?
down for
Oof.
3 hours. Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. Because most people usually pick the ones with the people that they're interested in listening to, but I had time to burn. Well, in a way, regardless. The analogy that I heard from Sam Harris is that if you're walking through a city and there's people out on the streets that are just randomly talking to you that you've never met that are just passing by, you wouldn't necessarily take what they have to say very seriously,
Mm.
especially when you have somebody that is perhaps very unhealthy out on the streets of wherever in the world. You wouldn't even pay them any mind if they're saying something threatening or negative. And yet, when it comes to our thoughts, we have these vagrant entities within our conscious experience that do the same thing. They're never to be seen again. They're just passing through. They're saying random things. And yet, we have an inclination to take them seriously and engage with them every single time.
Mm.
Whereas you might have entities that are recurrent within your sort of, as you're walking down this figurative street of consciousness, that are actually friends. And they might have things to say which aren't necessarily easy to digest, but it's better to listen to them because you're going to be seeing them for a lot of the time that you're alive. I saved that sentence eventually. Interesting. Changing tack a bit, because we got really deep into the psychology, but perhaps some of the people listening would be interested to hear the student life aspect.
Mm.
When did you decide to go to Oxford? Was it something that you did when you were really young and you just locked it in, or was it more of a last minute decision?
Well, Oxford, in my realm of being, in I guess my life circumstances, I mean, about 50% of the people who go to Oxford are from private school backgrounds, right? They're from a background that is kind of, they are primed to, you're smart enough to get into Oxford kind of thing, or that's the realm. I mean, my parents immigrated from the Philippines to the UK, so we're starting off from kind of scratch, really. And I was born in the UK, just kind of went to school. I was expected to get a good education and get a good job because hey, that's what life is, right? I was actually en route to do medicine in uni and be a doctor, but there's part of me that, well, I was convinced that I wanted to do medicine mainly because there was like my parents had planted these things in my head that hey, you should do medicine, blah blah blah. And I was about to do it, to be honest. In sixth form, I took the subjects biology, chemistry, maths, and psychology. I put psychology on the end because that's actually what I wanted to do. But biochem maths was in there because that's what you needed to get into med school. But you know, I had been at the point of when I went to sixth form, I had been to Oxford once in my life, and that was on a school trip, a very spontaneous school trip actually, where the English teacher came up to me and two of my friends. We were just walking during lunchtime, and they told us, "Hey, there's a trip tomorrow to go to Oxford. If you guys want to come, there's free spaces." And we were like, "Yeah." It was a one-day residential at Jesus College, so we went to
Oh,
Oxford.
wow.
Yeah, exactly. I've actually stayed there then. So we went to Jesus College for a day, and hey, it was a really nice trip. Oxford was absolutely beautiful. I love the city, but never did I think I would be there to actually go to uni. I just thought, hey, that was a fun trip, whatever. The next time I encountered Oxford was, well, let me just say that after GCSEs, I got really good grades. So I thought, okay, I got good grades, I can become a doctor. Well, that's what my parents want. But I think beforehand, I actually told my parents that I wanted to do psychology, which they were like, "What the heck is psychology?" Because no one really, like, especially the older generations, don't know what it is. Considering it's a new science, it's kind of like associated with therapy and stuff, and that's the only thing that people think you can get out of it. When in actuality, there's a lot more to psychology, such as knowing about people, etc. Anyways, so the next time I encountered Oxford was at the Unique Summer School, which is a bridging program for people from backgrounds that are not necessarily people. Basically people don't necessarily are used to going to university from those like postcode areas or like schools or etc. So I signed up to this program in like January of 2018, I think. I managed to get in, and then for that summer, there's a 5-day course of me doing experimental psychology in Oxford. with other people on the same program. So they basically take you through the course. It's incredible. It's an incredible experience, actually. Any experience, I think, that's about like 5 days or so, where where you basically meet random people who are interested in the same things, are always like incredible experiences. So we did these 5 days where we basically had like intense lectures, intense like work that they gave us, kind of like how Oxford's actually like. But because it was so interesting to me, because you're used to learning subjects that you're not really interested in at school and stuff because you're kind of forced to do it. But it's the singular subject that I was interested in the most for the whole time, and everyone's interested in it. You can joke about like specific things within the subject. That's the kind of vibe that I really liked, which is kind of what Oxford really is, if you think about it. So
Hmm.
after that experience is kind of when I decided I want to apply here, and I'm going to apply here. I don't care.
So with experimental psychology, was that what you put down for this summer school? Was there a list of options and that's the
Yeah.
one that you picked, or was it were you did you have multiple preferences and then that's the fateful choice that sort of led
Hmm.
you to your current degree?
It was, you could choose two different things. You could choose a first choice, which I put experimental psychology, and a secondary choice if you wanted to do something else, which I left blank actually, I think.
Oh,
You're allowed to leave it blank. But basically, if you don't get into, if there's not enough space on the first one, they'll put you into the second one. But I think because of this course, it kind of taught me what Oxford would be like. And the city is absolutely gorgeous, let's be honest. There's not many cities that are like it in the world at all. So, other than Cambridge.
I don't know if they're that good.
It's the Oxford
It's
Cambridge
not
rivalry.
comparable. Yeah, yeah.
Anyways, so that's kind of what pushed me to applying to Oxford, because in the UK education system, I think it's a lot easier to actually get into Oxbridge compared to if you're abroad. Because first of all, it's cheaper because of student loans, etc. It's a lot cheaper than what international students have to pay. And second of all, is because you can apply to 5 different universities in which you only pick 2 after you get the offers. Like after you get offered, if you get an offer, a positive offer from every uni, like, hey, we'll take you if you get these grades, you can only pick 2, one firm and one insurance, which the firm choice is if you get the grades, you get in. The insurance choice is if you don't get the grades, this one should have lower grades, so then you'll go to the insurance. So at the end of the day, you have 5 applications. You might as well use one on Oxbridge if you think that you're capable of getting those AA star grades after sixth form. Only if you like the subject. I wouldn't recommend applying to Oxford if you are going to apply for something you don't like, because that's going to be hell. I won't lie to you.
Although interestingly enough, this discussion of interesting and curious and passionate is somewhat new to me because the first 4 year degree that I did was in Russia. And prior to that, the last several years of my high school experience were at a Russian embassy school. And I guess it's a holdover from the Soviet time. But although interest to a degree was present because teachers, whether they're Russian, American, or British, still had that human connection to students and noticing whether or not a person genuinely enjoyed what they were learning. I think the focus was much less. And for the uni that I went to in Moscow, that was diplomatic, or at least originally, and then it sort of grew out to include other degrees like mine. If you did international relations, which was sort of one of the prestigious big deal degrees, you would have to learn 2 foreign languages, and the assignment to your language pair would not be under your control. So you would just
Really?
somebody would randomly get Swahili and maybe French, and that's it. Because the reasoning was, and it's still there to this day, although people can now exert a bit more pressure and apply and say this really doesn't align with my interests. And you only really get through if you can make a strong and compelling case that the whole reason you're doing this degree is for a specific purpose. Even then, it's not guaranteed. However, the reasoning was that the Soviet Union would completely pay for your degree. Even now in Russia, I think it's something like 80 or 90% of the spaces at uni are paid for by the
Oh,
government. And so the government's going to pay for your education. That's cool. And in return, you're going to do what the government needs. And so someone sits there and says, we need 300 people that speak Swahili or 300 people that speak Portuguese. And then you just get lumped in. Whereas in the UK, because it's more of a mixed market slash capitalist system where if there's too many lawyers in a given year, then that will be the lawyer's problem. And who are we, the central government, to really have the hubris to predict every single motion in a complex system? It's primarily based on self motivation with incentives built in. So maybe you want to become a doctor because it offers societal status and a certain income and a certain way of life. But it's not like the government is really compelling you with the same level of incentive. And so, in a way, sometimes I get intimidated because for the longest time in high school, no one really asked me what I was passionate about. You need to do this, you need to do this. The government has decided that these are the subjects that are mandatory. And even when I did my bachelor's degree, we had only one elective every term out of something like 8 subjects. The ninth one, roughly, would be, and even then from a narrow list, because the idea was that if in the US you have this whole catalog of possible subjects and it's your sort of responsibility to put them together like a bunch of Lego bricks to build the degree that you want, and then you look up, oh, if I want to be an engineer, I need to have this, this, and this, and the rest is up to me. In Russia, it's kind of the same, but it's not you that's doing the Lego blocks, it's the government. And so they look through all of the possible subjects that can be taught at a uni, and they say, if you want this degree, these are the subjects you're doing. And so I think fundamentally, the interest-based system historically has been more effective in many ways. Although, if you look at Soviet science and Soviet mathematics, or even today, it's very strong. So I guess you could say that a broken clock is right twice a day on the one hand, but maybe there's something to it. The whole interest system is kind of, I guess, endearing to me because it suddenly feels like, oh, hey, someone cares about what I care about. Maybe it's mutually beneficial for both the lecturer and me if I'm showing up because at least half the time, even if some lectures are more interesting than others, generally I have this background interest that's motivating me, as opposed to we're going to give these facilities to you for free. We're even going to pay you to do it, but it's going to be what we need, not what you need. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and I want to say it's better, but I guess it really depends on how you qualify better. Better for me, better for society, better for everyone. I don't know. Intuitively, it seems more humane in a way. It seems more it seems kinder to let people pick what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, to let people pick what they want to do it's good. I think it's amazing for the people who have that interest or have that knowledge of this is a particular thing that I really like. I think everyone does have that to some extent. But in a world where you're forced to pick what you want to do at such a young age, especially if you want to be a doctor, like specifically, like when you do medicine, you're stuck in medicine. You can do research, but majority of people are going to become a doctor at the end of that, and they're forced to make that decision at the age of like 16 when they pick their A levels. In the UK, anyways. So I think there's so much more pressure on the individual to make that decision or to know what they're doing, even though it doesn't really make sense considering we're going to live to like 80 or 100 based on modern medicine. So if you're going to live that long, why do you need to have your life figured out when you're only a quarter of the way through, when you have 3 quarters left or even more time left? I think that's one of the flaws of, I guess, letting them choose. But at the same time, if someone really doesn't want to do something and then the government tells them, hey, you have to do this, and they're just kind of like, what? There are pros and cons, I think, to each system, and neither is perfect. I don't think there can ever really be a perfect system. Is Well, that's my belief. Because how can you possibly balance the interests of people in the interests of a country? Because, like, for example, regarding the interests of the country, the interest of a particular person, for example, the leader of a country, will benefit a lot more from the interest of a country. So there's then that imbalance of like what the people want, what the country want, or what I don't know, just like what people want in general. There's always going to be some sort of conflict, which is really hard to like wrap your head around of how much people it actually affects, or how many people the system actually affects.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like smaller governments, to a degree, have it a bit easier. At least they don't have it easier in that their foreign policy is not. They can't get away with as much if you're the size of Luxembourg.
Yeah,
You can't exactly say, so anyway, we're going to exert military pressure in the, the Atlantic Ocean. However, if you have a more homogeneous population, you can resolve a lot of issues faster because your low resolution model slash stereotype of what the average Luxembourgian, who knows, people in Luxembourg do. I'm sure they'll let me know if they ever come across this. That average person shares many characteristics with their neighbor, whereas the larger a country gets, especially if it's ethnically diverse and culturally diverse, like the Russian Federation or the United States or the United Kingdom, especially the first two, although the UK is also diverse, perhaps just not at that same massive scale comparatively. It's tough because unless you if you belong to a particular in group that's nested within that nationality, your model of people's expectations, assuming that you're not just a Machiavellian politician, which is often the case, but even if you had the best intentions in mind, your model of what people desire is going to be fundamentally skewed towards your in group. And if you've got in Luxembourg, you could say that maybe there's one or two in groups on a certain level, whereas in the US, there's probably 500 in groups on the cultural level. And so if the Senate and the House of Representatives is primarily composed of in groups 1, 2, and 3, in groups 4 to 500 are just hoping on chance that, yeah. Coming back to you again, do you think if you weren't doing a degree right now, and what do you think you would be doing?
if I wasn't be doing a degree,
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I'd be working on some sort of like media and stuff. I've always liked creating videos and like just editing, video production, photography, that kind of stuff. I would honestly just be honing that. And in all honesty, after I finish this degree, I might be going into that anyway.
Mm.
Um, so the reason I took psychology, or one of the reasons I took psychology, is because it's such a broad degree. You can apply it to literally anything. And because I don't know what I want to do exactly, it makes more sense to pick something that's broad rather than something like, for example, if I did law, I'm going to be a lawyer of some sort. There's no denying that. Well, I guess you could go into some other jobs, but majority of people who take law will become a lawyer of some sort, or work in law. And I didn't want to be trapped in that kind of box, especially for example, if I ended up choosing a specific degree, and I end up doing it, and then I end up feeling like there's no way out. Because there always is a way out, but it's just very hard to diverge from that, considering you spent X amount of years of your life developing that and leading up to that, and then you're like, oh wait, it's been wrong this whole time.
Mm.
But the chance that you're going to drop all of that to change is so low because, I mean, you put in all the effort, right? And then now you have to be committed, or that's how you feel like you should be. And I didn't want to be trapped in that, basically.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I guess I share that sentiment to a large degree because although becoming a clinical psychologist or a psychological researcher or anything else that's more related to my degree is on the table, there's a few other sort of career paths that I can still see as attractive to me. And so I guess as you're doing a degree, you're still figuring out what it is you want to do. And thankfully, with the vacation period and just leisure time in general, if you have the self control to not just be sort of attached to a screen at least half of the time, that's an incredible opportunity as a student to explore other interests. Which often, like you said, if you're going down the traditional path of going straight into uni and then going straight into a job, it's harder to find the time to really
mm,
course correct. Yeah.
I mean,
Hmm.
I'm curious what you would be doing if you didn't decide to do psychology.
If I didn't decide to do psychology, then one of the things I've been dipping my toes into on several occasions has been stand-up comedy. I enjoy watching it. I enjoy doing it, although I'm actually only going to do my first gig in London this Friday. So that will be fun. We'll see how we
Oh,
go.
nice. Wait, tomorrow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, damn. I should revise my set. Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. I did a few things in Moscow at an English stand-up club, but then halfway through one of my sets, I, there was something weird about the laughter, and I said, "Hang on, guys, how many of you are fluent in English?" And a lot of the people just smiled, and one guy was like, "My name is Vladimir." And oh no, oh no, this isn't. But it was still a good experience. And speaking of stand-up, I'm also going to see Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle this Sunday, so that's going to be incredible. I'm really. Let's come back to the question. Stand-up is one. And then perhaps something to do with media. But I guess fundamentally, I'm just obsessed with people, in that if you had the time and energy, you could spend 20 years with every single person that you know, because as you get older and your peer group is roughly within your same age group, it, there's all of that life experience and entangled in each person. So any career associated with that. And so I guess fundamentally the answer is either stand up or psychology. I guess it is that binary at this point, because fundamentally both of those are about interfacing with other human beings, but in very different ways. One is sort of more meticulous and empirical and pinning butterflies onto a wall to understand the structure of their wings. And the other one is kind of like going through a butterfly garden and seeing them all sort of whiz around, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Interesting though how you're seeing Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle. That's insane, mate. And also, good luck with your gig tomorrow. That's gonna
Yeah, it's
be
going to be a humbling experience, because
yeah.
no matter
Improv.
how well or how poorly I do, going to an arena and seeing those two titans of comedy perform is
Oh,
going to
true.
be,
Also,
yeah, 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 yeah.
I mean, also from what I found is stand up is so hard. I don't know. I've never done it myself, but it looks easy because they make it look easy. But the timing of the jokes, the actual getting the audience to understand the jokes is like for like a whole hour sometimes. These people do it for ages. That's actually ridiculous. I'm more thinking that I will try out some improv comedy because I think for me that's easier to just come up with something on the fly. But stand up, like you have to actually like plan the routine. You have to be like, okay, I'm going to say this at this point. I'm going to look at this person, then I'm going to say this thing to this person. Because, I mean, even sometimes at stand up, they do some improvised comedy, which is insanely funny. And I don't think you get the same level of funniness with just like traditional improv, where you just like take a prompt, go to the prompt, do something ridiculous. I think the joy in improv is different because it's more childish. You just do whatever. Stand up is more so like I'll put it into an analogy where the stand up comedian's like a painter who plans out where they're going to put the strokes and like plans out what it's going to look like at the end, whereas improv is just like if someone's sketching in the notepad, figuring out where it's going to go.
Yeah, that does. Although it also sort of loops back to that incident with Pablo Picasso when I think he was in France, and a lady came up to him in a park and said, "Oh, could you do my portrait?" And so he whipped out an easel, and he, with a single brush stroke, he did her entire portrait. And she said, "Oh, that's fantastic. How much will you charge?" And he said, "Oh, 5,000 francs," which I guess was the equivalent of like 5,000 USD. He said, "But it only took you 3 seconds to do that." To which Picasso then said, "Young lady, it took me 30 years to be able to do that in 5 seconds." And so I think with improv and with stand up, even if the whole beauty of it is to keep it in the moment, but, and make it look as though it's spontaneous, but there's actually years and years that are layered on top. But I share your sentiment with improv, where it feels as though there's less of a burden, in that you just go on stage and you do what you do, rather than the additional pain of having put in all of that planning only to see it fall apart. Yeah. And in a way, I guess our degree has that component where it's not like you just show up to exams and freestyle. It's like, here's what I think. There's an element of planning to it, and that represents a sacrifice. And it's like the eternal question all the way back from Cain and Abel, where it's like, what makes a good sacrifice? Because the only thing more painful than not doing a sacrifice and not getting what you want is doing a sacrifice and still not getting what you want.
Yeah.
That really messes with people and their heads. Yeah.
I think that
Mm.
can also maybe be applied to, taking the traditional route of choosing a job and then doing that job. It's like you put in the sacrifice, but then you might not get what you want out of it, really, because how could you possibly know until you're in that position? Like, you could think, hey, I want to be a doctor because it sounds kind of fun. Like, I'll be in the wards, we'll be doing something different every day, seeing different people every single day. But in reality, they're like low key NHS, people get underpaid,
Mm,
reality,
mm.
actually. They're being overworked, and it becomes routine also because you're just doing the things that you have to do rather than really engaging with the actual material that you've been taught, which is maybe what you were interested in the first place, but now you're just doing it like actively rather than like kind of reading research papers on like new stuff. And like you're not really, I guess you are actively learning things as a doctor because you do have exams like every few years because you have to, especially at the rate that medicine is progressing. But I think that, especially just generally, I think when we think of a certain job, we never really understand what it fully entails until you're in it, which is why it's so hard to decide for me, to be honest. Because, like, psychology, I do enjoy doing psychology, but I also enjoy being an academic to some degree, but I don't want to be an academic for my whole life, which is why I don't want to do research, is why I've realized. Well, it's why I don't want to do research long term because I feel like, especially once you go into research, that's kind of like your whole life at that point. Because
Mm, mm.
you know, if you become a big name in the field, you do like one research article that was like a big one, and then you just leave. People are just gonna be like, what happened to that person? Are they still researching? And you're like, no, I changed careers, even though you like the majority of these people are literally devoting their whole lives to researching this particular thing that they're interested in. Hopefully, because they actually enjoy that. And I think in most cases it is actually, but I don't think it's for me.
Well, I think enjoyment's a really interesting one because our modern conception of what enjoyment is relatively new.
True.
We've come a long way with technology, and so if formerly we look at Europe in the medieval period and we think, oh, they must have had miserable lives. But although someone told me about the history of emotion or emotional history, which is like this sort of growing field, I doubt that most people who were peasants constantly ruminated on the fact that, oh, I'm so miserable compared to this and this and this. That was just their existence. And from my very limited knowledge, a lot of the meaning they derived was from family, community, the idea of an afterlife, and the idea that their suffering was meaningful. Whereas now, the meaningfulness of our suffering is usually translated into currency. And if we're lucky, the product of our work is meaningful. So if you're a doctor, maybe you saved someone's life. Or if you're a carpenter and you've made something beautiful and you're legitimately proud of your work, even if it's going in someone else's home, you know that that's now being put into the world. And so those seem to be the big two when it comes to getting meaning out of what you where your primary sacrifice is, your work, your labor. And a lot of people don't have either of those things. If you're just working in, say, an entry level finance degree, you don't yet have the income so that you can then outside of work do something meaningful. And you're not really producing something where you're like, yippee, the New York Stock Exchange is 3% more effective thanks to my work. And I think that's the real killer because there's jobs that may never lead to some incredible
Mm.
income, depending on what your metric is, but they are meaningful. And you build a community. If you're the one guy who's the best bricklayer in the village or in the town, and every time you build something, it's just phenomenal, it's going to last 100 years. I'm sure that if you gave someone the option of earning $1 million every year and doing that, a surprising number of them would remain bricklayers, although the experiment's yet to be done. I came at this because of enjoyment. And a distinction that I think I brought up before with you, well, what just in the daily ritual of our tutorials or the weekly ritual, was the difference between an amateur and someone who's passionate. Because
Mm.
amateur comes from the French aimer, to love, whereas passionate comes from the Latin patio, pain, to suffer.
Oh,
And the
really?
passion of Christ is the suffering. Yeah, this is fascinating. I looked it up once on Wiktionary or Wiktionary, and I just went down this rabbit hole. Passion comes from pati. That's why a patient in the medical world is someone who's suffering. And when we tell a child, be patient, etymologically, we're saying, please suffer for a noble cause. You don't
Mm.
tell a kid to stare at paint dry. You don't tell them to be patient because that's not something that's worthy of their suffering. And even the most strict parent would consider that to be pretty cruel to ask a child to not be bouncing around just for the hell of it. Usually, if it's because they're waiting in line or waiting for food to be ready, but they're being patient because what they're waiting for, what they're suffering for, is worth the effort. That's what you're trying to communicate. And so I think the difference between an amateur boxer and a passionate boxer is that the amateur boxer only does it when he loves it. Whereas and on the days that it isn't fun and on the days that it hurts, they might not come in and they might leave early. But the passionate boxer is the person who stays there even when it's suffering. And I think it was Mike Tyson on the Joe Rogan that said, what was it? Passion is doing something you hate as if you love it. And if you look at the parable of Christ, for instance, that's not to get profound, but just as an easy example, that's someone who did something that was horrible, the epitome, sort of a very good symbol of the thing that you'd least want to do, be crucified, especially as an innocent person. And yet he did it because of the love of human beings or the belief that it was meaningful. And I guess we make a big deal at Oxford, and the Oxford admissions team says that, oh, you should be passionate about what you do. But we don't really examine. We all know that someone who's passionate about something is usually at a higher level of expertise than someone who's an amateur. But etymologically, there's a lot of meaning to that. The person that loves it and the person that suffers for it. And definitely at Oxford, it feels like a lot of the time, the prerequisite is you have to be ready to suffer for your degree. You can't just show up on the days when you love it and on the days when it's pleasurable, because you would have done it anyway. Whereas the suffering is kind of part of it. Yeah. I don't
That's
know if you feel that
interesting.
way. It's a long sort of aside, but party is interesting. And the passion of Christ is the love of Christ, but also the suffering of Christ.
I think I actually understand that to some degree because for me, well, in terms of video editing, it can get so tedious at times that you kind of just want to rip your hair out because it's like every single clip you gotta like get, and then sometimes the program lags out, especially if your laptop's not that good, and then just it crashes, and you're like, oh, I have to do that thing all over again.
Oh
Yet,
boy.
yet for me, I still do it because I don't know. There's something about it that I really enjoy, which is why I kind of want to go into that field of producing like something. Maybe one day I want to produce some sort of like masterpiece, whatever. Just some sort of like really artistic thing in video format. That'd be really cool. I think that would be really fun. I have no idea what I'm going to do yet. I just kind of want to learn it to the point where I'm really good at it. But with academics, I can do the suffering, but it's something that's I do reluctantly. I think maybe that's the difference between an amateur and a passionate person is that you go into something, maybe an amateur is willing to suffer, but they're not they're not like they're not rearing to go at it, if that makes sense. They're like, I've got to do this thing. I guess I'll do it because I have to, rather than, oh, I have to do this thing. It sucks, but like I really like this thing and I want to keep doing it, so I'm going to do it, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Although something I've noticed is that if you think about, for instance, in my case, comedy and studies as two crucifixes, we're coming back to it. And then there's a carrot at the top of the crucifix, and it's hanging off, and and you get to munch on it. And this is a very elaborate metaphor. You get to munch on it
Okay.
when you're bearing the cross of the studies. You have the cross plus the carrot, and then you look at the cross that's like lying on the wall that's reclining there. That's, for instance, in my situation, comedy. You only see the carrot because you don't feel the weight of that cross. You're only
I
looking at the
see.
carrot. And so when you swap out and then you do just the comedy and now it's the study, now you feel the burden of the comedy cross plus the carrot of the cross, or sorry, the carrot of comedy and the cross of comedy, and then you look at the studies and you only see the carrot. So whichever one that you're actively engaged in, it's
Mm.
like you said before of how there's a difference between what you think an experience will be like and what it actually entails. Whatever the thing that you're not doing is at present or that you're not engaged with, the carrot's more prominent and you tend to forget the weight of that cross. So fundamentally, sometimes I worry and I think, you know, I'm so fortunate to be at Oxford. So many, it's been my dream, and so many people wish that they could do the degree. And then I'm like, how can I think that this is auxiliary? And then I swap out, and it's the same with comedy. I think fundamentally, we always have that bias that we have to correct for. I might be wrong. It might just be that one is more interesting than the other, but I'm not going to say it here on the podcast. And I might be wrong. So who knows? It's
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying as well. Like when you engage in something so much that becomes so tiresome for you, and then you're like, oh, I'd rather be doing that, and then you do that thing, and then it's the same thing over there. So I guess the actual dilemma comes with choosing what you want. In what field do you want to suffer?
Yeah, yeah. Picking your cross rather than having it picked for you. Because it's easier to go up against something and at least you say, well, this is rough and this sucks harder than I thought it would, but I picked it, so I might as well do it, rather than when somebody else just picks it for you, because you don't even get the carrot. You don't even there's not even a reason that you get up in the morning and it's not like, well, I'm doing this because I want to save lives or because I want to make people laugh or because I want to make a masterpiece. You just have to withstand all of the slings and arrows of whatever it is that you're doing that's been imposed on you, and you don't ever get the beautiful meaning to it. You don't ever get that sort of fundamental spiritual component, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think this is why people don't like secondary school or like high school or whatever you want to call it, because it's at the point where you're able to think for yourself, but you're forced to do all of these things, so many subjects, like 9, 10, 11 subjects that you don't want to do, but you're forced to do them. So it's you sit. I remember every time in secondary school, I just sit in a class, or like, for example, in chemistry, even. I did enjoy chemistry to an extent, but I'd be sitting in the class. I'd just be staring at the clock, waiting for it to end because I did not choose to do this. It was just kind of something that I had to do.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
Whereas if I would, for example, this psychology degree, I sit in the lecture. I'm like, I'm going to absorb these notes because I choose to do it. I'm not going to look at the clock. I'm just going to take it in because looking at the clock is kind of implies that I don't want to do it, but I chose to do it, so I might as well stick it out rather than in secondary school or whatever. You're forced to do these things and you hate it.
Yeah. Well, because in a way that it's people are asking you to be patient, the society and the teachers are, because it's quote unquote for a good reason. But the issue is that it's not immediately apparent what that good reason is until
Mm,
you've experienced it yourself. Looking back, you think, oh, thank goodness I went through all of that because I can now go to university and there's all of these incredible opportunities. But that's when you've eaten the whole carrot and your belly's full, but you've forgotten what it was like to. But you have the memory, but you don't have the direct experience of just how rough it is to go through all those years. A lot of people wish that they could go back to their childhood, but I often, and there were a lot of moments that were really great. But on the whole, I look back at most of the years of my life and I think, thank goodness I'm here. This is the best it's ever been. No way would I go back to do that again. Once was enough. Not that it was some horrific thing, but just on the whole, so far, every year of my life has been better than the previous one, both due to external circumstances and to a degree through my own work, because it's sort of two planets rotating around each other, that self circumambulation that Jung talked about, that you're trying to discover who it is that you are and what it is that you want to do. And to the degree that you're able to sort of piece together who it is that you are, which is kind of like a freaky concept, your routine, it's an increasing number of crosses that you've chosen and a decreasing number of crosses that are just foisted upon you. but I guess when you're young and you don't even know who you are, you haven't become someone, then it's better to have at least something foisted on you than nothing at all. One could, or at least when you don't yet have the wherewithal to make an informed decision, when you might choose to want to be an actor at 10, not because you legitimately love the thespian arts, but because it seems like it doesn't have homework. And then you make it to Hollywood, and it turns out that it's 20-hour days rather than 5 hours at school. And you're like, oh, but this isn't the reason I came into this is not what I'm getting out of it. Yeah. But we're so fortunate in the West to even be able to ruminate about, am I doing the right thing? And I was on the tube something like a month and a half ago, and there was a lady talking to presumably her Tinder date based on like the energy and the vocab. And she was saying that I just wish I had a passion. She said, you have a passion. I don't have a passion. I don't know what I want to do. And that's a genuine, I don't say that to be disparaging to her. She was actually being very vulnerable on the tube, perhaps a bit too loudly, but she was drunk, so that's fine. But this was a real thing that was tearing at her soul. She admired this person for having this calling, and she felt like, obviously, the reason she brought it up is because not only did she not have one, but she wanted one. She felt like she should have one. And we've come a long way from a world where if your dad was a cobbler, then you were going to be a cobbler. If you were a girl, then you were going to get married to someone who was a cobbler or a landowner. And we're in new territory, generationally speaking. There's been probably hundreds of generations that have had to deal with just, okay, so I know already what I'm going to be, what I'm going to have to be. So I might as well just learn how to put up with it and find the beauty within what I already know that I'm going to do. Whereas now, for a very small percentage of the planet, really, compare, but we have that skewed perspective. For our environment generally, or at least mine, I don't presume to know the full extent of your interaction with the whole planet. But at least from my perspective, most people, that's their worry. You know, am I doing the right degree? Am I doing the right job? And it's like, that's so amazing. We get to be anxious about that rather than just set on rails. And we get to be the one but the problem with that is that the more that you're in control of your life, the more you're to blame if bad things happen to you. If you're just a peasant under a feudal lord, then yeah, maybe you could organize some wild escape. But if you already have a wife and kids, then you have to think about them. And so you're suffering, but at least A, you think there's an afterlife, and maybe there is, who knows? I'm not an authority on the matter. But B, it's not all your fault. Whereas in the modern world, you can make a much more compelling case for someone that's 40 and hates their job. And it's like, well, yeah, but A, you can still do something about it. And B, a lot of the reason that you're here is because of decisions you made. So it's a double-edged sword. We're to blame, but we're also to be, us and our community and the people that surround us are jointly responsible for our experience of life.
It's interesting. I think to get to that regard also, how you talked about the people who maybe want to be young again and be a kid again, and they really don't like. Well, it's probably because they really don't like their present life, and I think maybe a reason for that is that they know in the back of their minds that it could have been different, but they didn't make the choices that maybe they would have wanted. Maybe they made the choices for other people, and I feel like there's a lot of resentment in that. I think a lot of times these days also, I think it's a lot of resentment to some people have a lot of resentment towards their parents because parents want the best for you in the majority of cases. I know there's some cases where it sucks, and I'm sorry if that's your situation. But in the majority of cases, your parents want the best for you, and sometimes, especially from immigrant parents, they're like, "Hey, this is the best for you. You better do this job. Let's say be a doctor, just because we brought it up already." And then the kid's like, "Okay, I'm gonna be a doctor because I don't know what to do." Because let's be honest, we don't know what we're doing. No one really does, and some people take that in a different way, where it's like, "I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm gonna let other people do it for me." And then
Mm-hmm.
once they let other people do it for them, they realize that maybe they could have made a different choice and they don't like their current circumstance. So maybe they want to be a kid again so they can remake those choices.
Yeah,
I wonder if
yeah.
that's a reason actually. I just came up with that now.
Well, there's I think something called Peter Pan syndrome, but I think that might be from parapsychology and pseudopsychology rather than the real empirical deal. I'm not sure, but it does make sense. And in a way, I suppose my current interpretation of negative emotion has been that it's a call to arms. It's a signaling device. It's not supposed to be some, it should be emotion informs action rather than action. Emotion should sort of say, hey, something's wrong, or you're on the right track, keep going. And I have rapidly cycling bipolar disorder, which means, and it was interesting that my girlfriend recently told me, Rick, every month you have this period when you're just you're really everything, your routine is the same, but you just feel really glum and like everything's wrong. And she's incredibly supportive, but she was trying in the kindest way possible to tell me, this will pass. You feel this way every single month, which in a way makes it more painful because how can my emotional experience be so visceral and yet unsubstantiated based on my neurochemistry rather than the circumstances which are within my control? It's almost, I don't want to use the term invalidating because that's sort of too associated with our peers that are like, everything needs to validate me. Maybe it feels good, I'll admit it. But regardless, I'm going on too many tangents. Coming back to what I wanted to say, when I feel bad now, as much as I can, I try to go to the gym or I try to eat or I try to just get outside. And even though I really don't feel like doing anything, I want to just slump into bed or not do anything. That's the exact opposite of what sadness is trying to tell me. The whole purpose of sadness is to tell me, hey, where you are right now is not good. I'm going to keep on cranking up this dial of sadness that you really don't like until you get the message that it's time to go do stuff. And it's really rough, but I think that realization has been useful to me when I'm able to overpower it. Because I'll like show up to do boxing in the afternoons, and in the first 10, 20 minutes, I will feel like, oh man, I'm just going to puke. I'm going to lose consciousness. I'm like, I shouldn't be here. I should just go home. I'm not in the mood. But of the past 3 times that I've been in that experience and gone, without fail, I come out of it and I feel incredible. And I never believe it. I never believe that. I think that today is the exceptional circumstance under which, but it's weird. It feels like our emotions are there to rouse us. And so for the people that wish they were kids again, in a way, I suppose that for some amount of them, that's a way of saying, oh, I wish I could change my circumstances, but I could only do that as a kid, and therefore I'm not responsible. And the truth of it is that you can always, to some degree, change your circumstances, not as easily as when you are a child, but perhaps for some, what was it, Festinger in 1950 something? Not sure. Festinger in psychology, I need to revise those early social psych lectures, had that cognitive dissonance model. And when we talk about attitude change, sometimes it's easier to change your mental attitude than it is to change your behavior. Rather than thinking, oh, smoking is bad, so I should stop smoking.
Yeah.
If it's too hard to stop smoking, you just say, actually, smoking might not be that bad. And so if it's really hard to change your job because you're afraid that, better to have the devil you know than the devil you don't, maybe rather than saying, oh, I should change my job, you think, oh, actually, change is impossible. And that's just like a defense mechanism. I can't presume. This is a fiery, spicy episode where we've talked about how like, oh wow, we're at Oxford, and they're like, oh, sometimes it sucks, and someone on the other end is just hoping to strangle us. Us as mid-20s guys your early 20s, I'm mid-20s, are saying, oh, you can always change your life. Someone in their 40s is just wanting to strangle us. But there's no such thing as bad publicity, eh? Until they figure out your address. That's when bad publicity, 100%. If people know your geolocation, that's when you can have bad publicity.
Yeah.
Until that point in time.
I mean, yeah. I mean, just like briefly on the tangent of publicity, like you could say like the worst things in the world, and like eventually, like that will low key increase your audience, and it sucks that that's the case. Like cancel culture. Very big tangent here. Very big tangent.
No, it's fair. Go on.
Okay. It's just like people like actively try to cancel someone, and then they succeed, and then they're no longer cancelled in like 2 years' time. So what is the point of cancel culture?
I think there's good intentions behind it, but again, it's impossible to do a statistical survey, which is to say that science alone can't isn't sufficient to describe the phenomena that each person has to deal with on a daily basis. That's a point that it's a strong conviction of mine that's unsubstantiated scientifically. But it's not just that science can't explain ghosts. Science can't explain things that show up daily, and not because science is somehow inferior, but just because that the domain of science is built to take measurable things that can be replicated by other peers and then reviewed. That's a great system. It works incredibly. But people who take science to be the be all and end all miss out on things that, the wider experience. And so cancel culture, for instance, is weird. It's I think fundamentally it's unhealthy, and that's not a hot take in our day and age. But it's not the first time that this has happened. My great grandfather wrote the book on mechanical engineering, literally in the Soviet Union,
Oh,
and he was declared an enemy of the state and sentenced to a
wait,
gulag.
what?
Yeah. I think this was under the Stalin era. My
Um,
grandma's really reluctant to talk about our genealogy, and so next time I catch up with her, I just asked her, "Could you build a family tree?" Because I want to know. I want to know. If she passes away without that knowledge, then that's that whole
mm,
link that's been gone. So, but she's reluctant. She's like, "Why do you want to know about that? It's all depressing. It's all like the Soviet times." She is an adherent of many Russian people that lived through the Soviet Union. That why open old scars? But it's like it's important to know so we don't cut ourselves again.
yeah.
Let's figure out what shit scarred us. If it's a bear, let's find the bear. Okay, that's not the best analogy when it comes to anyway. Point being, cancel culture. So my great grandfather, he was declared an enemy of the state and sentenced to Siberia. I believe he wasn't even circulating anything. He never confessed to being against this. It was just random. It was just a quota. They needed someone. He looked like he was in a position of power, or one of his colleagues didn't like the
I see.
fact that he was taking up the limelight. So he just said, "Oh yeah, he's anti-communist or whatever." So he gets sentenced there, but because he was a scientist, he was given a room with heating. Because scientists that were sentenced to the gulag lost connection, attempting to reconnect.
Were you
We'll
connected?
give.
Back.
Yeah, there we go. Scientists that were sent to the gulag often were given good conditions because you were still useful to the state, just like with degrees. We'll give you the amenities, but under the condition that you're useful to us. And so he survived. And then eventually he was given amnesty, and they said that, "Oh, yeah, anyway, you're not an enemy of the state anymore." And he came back. But I think cancel culture is related to Stalinism, Leninism. And I think both of those are a subset of a repeating archetype of the cleansing of us in group deciding that the problem is the snakes are inside of the city rather than outside of the city, that the city walls are useless if the city is full of evildoers. And so it's time for a cleansing. That's a spicy word nowadays. Or I mean, just in general. Yeah. But I mean, the McCarthy era Red Scare was the same thing. I think it's like a cyclic event
I
whenever a
think it.
community is large enough. When you
I think
think the
it
enemy is
definitely is.
outside.
It is a cyclic thing because I've recently been reading on Stoicism and the origins in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, in the Roman Empire and stuff. And emperors within the Roman Empire with the Stoics are people who are. I'm sure you're acquainted with Stoicism, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
to a degree.
So the people in Stoicism are literally just trying to be good people, are trying to live virtuously, are trying to, basically say like you shouldn't be robbing from these poor people. You don't need to live lavishly. You can like even if you have all the money in the world, it's good to be humble, all of that shebang, right? And then because they had these different ideologies to the emperor, it it kind of like their mere existence kind of made the emperor salty. Like it basically
Mm,
shows all their flaws, right? Like by being a good person, you make all the quote unquote bad people, but I don't think that's necessarily inherently bad people. I think it's just as a result of choices, to be honest. But you get these like bad people who are doing bad things, and they look at this good person and they're like, "Can you just shut up? Like, let me do my bad things without me having to question the
mm.
things that I'm doing." And then they just banish them. They get banished to like some place, sometimes even executed just from having these different ideologies, although they're actually probably quite useful to, the state in general, because they're teaching these people good values, be good people, which is good for a country, right? Like, I don't see how that's really bad for a country. I think the more good people you have, the more people trying to do good for mankind will inevitably develop some sort of society, right? But
Mm, mm.
they like I think it's just sometimes, when something's going wrong, in fact, these stoics aren't necessarily targeted initially. So usually they're targeted in times of turmoil where someone's needed to blame or like whatever. So they just kick them out temporarily, and then they come back when there's a new emperor. It sounds very similar to that, like with your
Yeah,
is it your grandfather who's kicked out.
yeah, yeah. He was, and I view that as sort of not the original cancellation, but perhaps the vintage cancellation, being an
O-
enemy of the state.
OG
The term
cancellation.
politically correct was culturally appropriated. I'm kidding about that, but in the terminology of that, it was rudely appropriated from the Russians, the dangerous whites, by the Western Europeans, the rich whites, comparatively to us. What happened was that in the Soviet Union, people would, if you spoke out a line in public, because anyone could be an informant, everyone could be listening, or even at home, some families fell apart because someone in the family was an informant and they were just sent it. There's
Mm,
all sorts of crazy stories. People would say, hey, what do you can't say that. That's factually correct, sure, but it's not politically correct. That's that could get you sentenced. You need to be careful because the subset of things which are true and false from a phenomenological or an experiential perspective, and the things which are true and false with respect to not getting sent to the gulag and getting put on a train only to be shot in the woods so no one can hear or see you, or spending 20 years of your life on a souped up charge, that's a smaller subset. And so I'm not out here lamenting the fact that, oh no, some people in America that are using Twitter a few too many hours in the day are the same as Stalin.
they're definitely not the same.
But it comes from the same vibe. And so that's a logical fallacy to condemn something purely by association, to say that, oh, my opponents are somehow tangentially related to this thing that we all agree is bad, and so therefore the opponents are bad. That's not that's not the case. But I think it is a little bit of an alarm bell when Western society begins to imitate or adopt the habits of a totalitarian regime. It's maybe cancel culture has some value to it, but we should probably pay attention and measure twice, cut once. Right now, it feels like we're cutting twice and not measuring at all. The court of law was designed so that families of equal power would not fall into blood feuds. That was a big part of it. It wasn't about if the Athenians often, if there was a smaller nation state, they would invade them and then they'd enslave them and then they'd send them apart, all of the families, and then just sell them and conquer the territory. The only time they believed in justice was when it would be too expensive for two roughly equally powerful nations to fight. So let's just agree on terms, and we'll have a long discussion, and once we settle, we won't bring it up again. That's what justice was originally for. Now it's become something much greater, where every individual has this religious, or at least sort of magical, relationship to the government, even though there's a massive power difference.
Yeah, it's huge
Theoretically, the
power
US
difference.
Army could crush any American, but it'd be inefficient because eventually, if that kept on happening, it'd just be a waste of energy for everyone, and we're better off just having a rule book. But cancel culture is people trying to democratize the law, I guess, in a way, or not, or maybe not democratize it, but to get a vocal minority that's masquerading as the emissaries of the majority that are unelected. No one elects them. They're just loud enough, and they're powerful, and they're cunning enough to shut down anyone who questions why they're unelected. And that group is attempting to create a new law book. And the way that they're doing it is by changing the definitions of words, because they can't change the laws. You can't change the laws if you're an unelected would-be leader. But if you can convince everyone that a certain word or a certain phrase is no longer acceptable or should be interpreted differently, then you can rewrite the laws without ever being a part of the government, which is great. I mean, sometimes, you look at the Jim Crow era in the US, that was horrific. But it's a double-edged sword. It's a powerful weapon to change words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what it sounds like though? Yeah, these individuals have power because of social media. But do you know what's low key more dangerous than that? What might be more dangerous is, maybe Zuckerberg once decides to silence certain words and just basically shows everyone this one view of the world, which is basically like anti-government or something. And now everyone believes that. I think that's, well, I mean, people say that in the future, the people who will have power, the people who basically run these social networks rather than governments themselves, because the government the government's powerful. Yes, they can do whatever they want to an
Agreed.
extent.
Agreed. 100% agreed. Yeah.
But something that might be more powerful is to show the majority of people, which is the common folk, if you wish, that this one viewpoint is correct and that the government are wrong. And then if they only show this one viewpoint to everyone, which they have the power to do now, considering that literally like over 1 billion people are on social media or whatever, if everyone sees this on a day-to-day basis, they slowly start to believe it. And once everyone believes it, then they can literally start some sort of uprising because of this, the divide created by social media. I mean, currently social media is dangerous in the sense that it increases divides between people, in that someone who believes one thing, let's say conservatives, other people who believe another thing, liberals, they have two different ideologies, right? But because they have belief in one thing, they'll engage more with their content. They're only showing that content. These people are only showing that content. So liberals are only showing liberal content, conservatives are only showing conservative content. And then they now hate each other because they think that it's like factually wrong. They think that the other people are factually wrong and refuse to have a conversation about it. And even if they do, they will not listen to each other because of this divide that's being caused because of kind of the increased social media like algorithms showing them like what they want to see. Pretty cool
Brave
stuff.
browser is, I agree with what you've said. The Brave browser on is like an alternative to Chrome or Edge or Internet Explorer. Rest in peace with that. It has this function on it's also a search engine, and you can wear, I think they're called goggles or lenses, and what that does is it puts a filter. I think it's for Google. I'm not sure how it works, but it puts a filter on your search results that is counter to what your usual machine learning profile is. And users can develop these goggles, and I guess the company also provides like default ones. And there's conservative goggles, anime goggles, anarchist goggles, and some of them are just if you're looking for a particular result, you already know what you're looking for. For instance, you're searching for free movies online, which is illegal, so you shouldn't do it. Yeah. Or, I don't know, you're looking on advice on how to grow tomatoes. So you can wear those goggles. Or what you can do on Brave is you can turn on goggles for a political viewpoint or a religious viewpoint that you may not share to see the search engine through another person's eyes. And I think I tried that recently and I hated it because all the results were wrong. It was really disgusting. It was, how could they be publishing these things? But it's interesting. And I think that might be, we used to have, I don't think opposite day was ever like at the level of Mother's Day or even April Fool's Day. But it'd be interesting to have a day when we
Or an
all
actual
agree to
opposite day.
expose ourselves to opposing. But to be able to do that, you have to recognize that you're already within a group, and that's sketchy because each of us sees ourselves as this sort of infinitely definable canvas. But the less we know about someone, the more we think we can put them in a box. If you know someone for 20 years, you will gladly say, even if I disagree with them politically, there's all of this to them. And so it's hard for us to recognize that I'm this or I'm that.
Yeah, I mean, like every person in theory could probably get along in some aspect of their lives. Like if you really think about all the aspects of life, there's not a single person that you'll probably meet that you don't have a singular interest, like common interest with.
Oh, I've met a few. I'm
Really?
100%. I've met it. No,
No way. Like,
I think
okay, let's say, I mean, let's give me an example. Give me an example. I'm
of
interested.
someone who I'm. I think it's the threat of violence, or if someone is so repugnant to you within that moment that you
Okay,
no longer have the readiness. I think what you're saying is true, but it's a question of your
yeah, that makes
patience.
sense.
Your patience bar extends, which is a tragedy in a way. It could be that the person who attempted to mug you was actually a virtuoso
Yeah,
painter.
I mean, to
But
be fair,
yeah,
if someone came up to me and was like, "I'm gonna fucking punch you in the face," am I allowed to swear? Is that
let me put that. I'll bleep that out.
cut that
What
out?
time is
Bleep
this?
that out.
1:30. I'll timestamp that.
Or
We're
you
all
can
good.
cut it
Keep
out.
going.
I'm gonna restart. So if someone came up to me like, "I'm gonna freaking punch you in the face" or something, and then like for no reason whatsoever, and you're not gonna listen to anything they have to say. Although maybe in another time and space, if you had met them, if they had met you when they're open to talking and not punching you in the face, then you'll probably find something if unless their views are also like completely different to yours. Well, the initial views they spout. Because I think, there's some people who have like opposite views to their parents, yet they still love their parents, but that's because, they've seen them over this prolonged period of time, like you said. There's probably some aspects which you can relate on, but you may not like them as a person, but you can, in theory, get along with them, which is it's a very like
In theory.
roundabout. Yeah, it's a roundabout thing because in actuality, you're not going to get along with them just based off how you meet them or like you know we make these judgments about people all the time without knowing it, and that's kind of just the label you're going to stick on them, like not good person, and then never listen to them.
Well, it's a good thing we're studying psychology because if there is any way of delving deeper into these questions, psychology is a prime candidate. I think we should wrap this up because we're coming in on an hour and a half. This has been really, really cool. I'm massively grateful that you've agreed to be a part of this wild experiment. And this has been a super interesting conversation. So hopefully we can do this again. And thank you for being patient because this is all new to me. I've mentally accepted that it, if I were to continue with this podcast for an extended period of time, it's inevitable if you are improving to look back at your earlier attempts and just cringe. But that's just the way of it. And this is probably you just got to try. So
Yeah,
you
I
get paid for the
appreciate
attempt.
it. Hey, it's a good attempt. I mean, I think if you want to try anything, you might as well go for it because otherwise you'll regret not trying. Like you wanted to start
Unless
this
you're
podcast.
Stalin, in which case he should
Unless
have
you
probably
want to
not
kill
tried.
everyone.
He
If
should have
you
not tried. Yeah, he should.
don't try taking over the world. I wouldn't
He
recommend
was the
it.
one person for whom that Mark Twain quote about how in 20 years from now you'll regret the things you didn't do more than you did. No. Sometimes he can have too much ambition. He was on the grind too often. I'll refrain from any further jokes about Josef Vissarionovich. What was his? I think that was his full name. Regardless, man wasn't even Russian, and he did us in. My man is anyway. Right.
Anyways,
So on that note of lethal genocidal dictators, we'll close it there. Luther, thank you so much. This
yeah,
has
it's
been
been
a
a
wonderful
pleasure.
conversation.
It's been a good convo with many tangents. Yeah, thanks for putting me on here. This has been Oxpod, I guess. Tune in next time.
You want to plug yourself? Where can people find you?
Oh
And
yeah. I
rest
forget people
postcode,
do
please.
that. At Luthers Online. That's at LUTHERSONLINE. Yes, I just looked at my keyboard to do that. Anyway,
And if you want to apply to Oxford and you've somehow listened to all of this in the hopes of thinking that this is the resource to help you go to Oxford, message Luther in the DMs with extensive essays and paragraphs. He is
maybe not essays. Or you can watch my videos on how to get into Oxford, which I have made on my YouTube
oh,
channel.
there we go. There we go. All right, I think that's it for today. But thank you so much, man. Take it easy, and
Awesome.
thank you to everyone at home listening to this.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, take it easy, man.
And